Okay, well, we'll get started then. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for showing up this afternoon to learn more and have a conversation about how to prepare for pastoral listening about 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion within a congregational context. My name is Carragh Erhardt, and I work at the National Office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada as a program coordinator on work related to sexuality and inclusion. We're gathering online today from coast to coast, from lands that have held and continue to hold significance to hundreds of Indigenous nations since time immemorial. I'm working today on traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The Presbyterian Church in Canada has apologized for our role in operating residential schools and the damage we've caused to Indigenous people, families, communities, and nations. The harm caused in particular from gender segregation, sexual abuse, and forced marriages within that residential school system demonstrates the fraught relationship that the church has had and in some ways continues to have with gender and sexuality. As we commit ourselves to continuing to listen and to tell the truth about the past, we also commit ourselves to respecting Indigenous spiritual practices, supporting Indigenous-led healing and wellness initiatives, and standing in solidarity with Indigenous people and communities. One of the ways that the PCC's reconciliation work overlaps with efforts related to Two-Spirit and LGBTQI+ inclusion is that both call the church into a process of addressing spiritual abuse and creating healthier church cultures. Some of the tips that I'm going to share today may be helpful as you approach topics like Indigenous rights and reconciliation within your congregation. And I'm always encouraging folks to look for the connections and the overlap in where we can build solidarities between these different justice efforts. Our presentation today is adapted from a workshop that I was asked to facilitate for a session of a Presbyterian congregation about a year ago. They were in the process of trying to decide whether to change their wedding policy, and they knew that they wanted to hear from people in their congregation, but they weren't totally sure how to go about that and wanted to have a conversation and some training on how do you prepare for these conversations, how can you structure them, and so I wanted to take that and clean it up a little bit and offer it to a wider group in the church, because I think a lot of congregations are asking similar questions, even if some of the decisions that the church has made are now a few years old. I think we're still figuring out how to have these conversations in a good way. So today we'll review some context and talk about some of those decisions, where they came from. We'll explore some tips to help leaders in planning and engaging in pastoral listening processes. And then I hope to leave lots of time towards the end to engage in your questions, and we can expand on any tools or topics that you want to explore further. While we'll try to keep most of the question and answer engagement to the end, feel free at any time to send a question through the Q&A function in Zoom. If you can't see a button immediately in your screen, it should be under the More menu. You could also send things through the chat to me if you're having any challenges with that. Grace McCreary is also here to help with any technical questions that you might have. And so feel free to reach out to Grace in the chat as well. When asking questions, I always try to offer a few reminders. So the webinar is being recorded. I generally don't read out people's names as I'm reading questions out, but just keep that in mind. Part of that too is to keep your questions general rather than being overly specific. We want the questions to help as many people as possible. And for specific situations, we can always follow up and have a conversation afterwards in a one-on-one way. And I always ask people to ensure that their question is a question. It sounds a little silly, but it really helps me know what you're asking and what you're trying to get at, rather than sometimes people will send in a comment and that can be interesting, but it doesn't always tell me what you're hoping to learn more about. There are a lot of different acronyms in usage, especially within Canada, to talk about people who don't identify as heterosexual and or cisgender. By cisgender, I mean people whose gender identity aligns with the sex or gender they were assigned at birth. Today, I'll mostly be using 2S LGBTQI+, which stands for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex. And then that plus sign is there to indicate that that acronym represents beyond and in addition to those identities, a wide and varied group of people and communities, even if they don't explicitly have a letter in that acronym. I may also default to shorter versions of the acronym. I might just say LGBTQ or queer and trans, mainly for an economy of time and words. But in any situation, I'm using these as expansively as possible. A disclaimer I also like to share with folks is that it's okay if you're not familiar with what all of these words mean. And if you come across words that you don't know, in no way do I think that these are like a central piece of content for this webinar, and they're not really a prerequisite to what we're going to be discussing. But as always, happy to answer questions in the Q&A time if there are words that I'm using that are unfamiliar and you want more context about. Okie dokie. So what do I mean when I'm talking about pastoral listening related to 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion? What is there for us to be talking about? And so in general, there are two sets of decisions that I think come up a lot within a congregational context that the PCC has adopted in recent years. First, there are the decisions around marriage and ordination. These decisions made were made in 2021. The first of which being that there's liberty of conscience and action for ministers and sessions to believe that marriage is a covenant relationship between a man and a woman, or to believe that marriage is a covenant relationship between two adult people. And then the second decision within that is that congregations and presbyteries may elect, call, and ordain LGBTQI people as ruling and teaching elders, whether they're married or single. To summarize that, these decisions remove an expectation of celibacy or heterosexual marriage that previously prevented LGBTQ+ people from certain ministry roles, namely as ministers and as elders on sessions. And they also allow sessions to decide whether to host weddings for same-sex couples and allow ministers to decide whether they will officiate weddings for same-sex couples. In cases where a congregation or minister elects not to be involved in weddings for same-sex couples, it is the policy of the PCC that they'll make a respectful referral to that couple for a congregation or minister nearby that would be willing to be involved. When we talk about wedding policies, it's important to remember that this is the responsibility of the session to set the policy for how the church building will be used. And sessions don't need to have a congregational vote in order to make those decisions. Often we find that can actually be a negative experience, in part because people tend to rush that kind of a vote. And sometimes it results in the session finding out that the congregation's in a very different place than they thought they were. And then people expect a decision to be carried out on the basis of that vote. So instead, we encourage more gradual sharing of information, listening to the congregation, giving yourselves lots of time and space to make an informed decision. And of course, we can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A if there's additional questions. The other main set of decisions relates to church statements about the need to repent of homophobia and transphobia, including recommendations about how we can go about repairing that harm. And these apply whether or not a congregation or minister elects to be involved in same-sex weddings. So the church as a whole, as we describe it, is expected to create respectful environments for people of all genders and sexual orientations. This can involve making changes to policies, practices, and procedures to better meet the needs of 2S LGBTQI+ people. It could be offering educational tools and opportunities to explore the roots of homophobia and transphobia in the church. It can also be talking about those impacts and how the church can contribute to repairing those types of harm. In both cases, so both in the decisions about marriage and ordination and the decisions about more broadly how we do ministry with LGBTQ people, the the question that can come up is, well, how do these decisions impact our ministry? So in a congregation, what are we supposed to do? What do we need to know? What's important to people in the pews? Before I get into some of the tips that I want to cover with you, I'm inviting us all to take a minute to reflect, and Grace is going to put up a little poll for us. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you right now with having conversations within your congregation about 2S LGBTQI+ inclusion? This can range anywhere from being super uncomfortable as like a number 1, feeling that you would avoid those conversations at all costs, and then 5 being very comfortable that you're someone who encourages these conversations. Just curious to get a little temperature check of where people are coming from as we get started. Great, I think we've got most responses in. So we're seeing a bit of a spread here, which is great. I love that there's different levels of experience and knowledge coming into this. And for those who already feel very comfortable, I hope that you still walk away from this with either some tools that you didn't have before or some language that you can use to help equip other people within either your congregation or within your presbytery to have these conversations in a good way. And for those who are starting from a place of being very uncomfortable and avoiding these conversations, I hope that we can get you at least up to a 3 by the end of this. Yeah. Okay. So before you start a listening process, I think it's important to begin by acknowledging that initiating these conversations about gender and sexuality, especially if you haven't had conversations in your congregation before, can feel very, very vulnerable, can bring up a lot of challenging emotions for different people. Some people might challenge and say, why are we talking about this at all? We thought this was a done deal or a fixed decision. The Bible has always been very clear on this. So there's a lot of challenges you might encounter, but I also want to say that it can be very, very rewarding. I think that it can teach us a lot more about the congregations we serve. It can help us deepen our relationships. And exploring your reasons for why you want to have these conversations, I think is a really important place to start in terms of having things that you can go back to help you feel grounded in conversations that get more complicated. And so asking yourself the question, what am I hoping will come from this listening process, is a good place to start. And by that, I don't mean plan a listening process, knowing what definition of marriage you want to convince people should be in your wedding policy. It's not generally effective. Rather, how do we start listening processes like this with an openness and a curiosity about what we may find out from our congregations? And start it instead from a place of clear communication, offering people a fair process and the opportunity to participate in that discernment process together. Like I said, this can be about deepening our understanding of who's in our congregation, what are their needs, what would better meet those needs. I'll often talk about this as well as like a health check for a congregation. And this could be about LGBTQ inclusion, but it could be about any number of other topics as well. Providing explicit and clear containers where people can share what they value about your congregation and your ministry context, and also what they might be hoping to get met in a different way, like what might be feeling a little uncomfortable, but not enough that they felt it was important to bring it up on their own. Yeah, creating these feedback processes, I think, is a good practice to develop, and it doesn't always have to be very formal, but it really helps build trust in congregational leadership when we do this. If you've been on a webinar with me before, you know that I talk a lot about trust as consistently setting and meeting expectations. So setting an expectation that it's important to leadership within your congregation that you hear from people about how they're doing and how your ministry is impacting them, and that you will respond from a place of accountability and appropriately when a need isn't being met or harm is occurring. I think these processes can help in strengthening community. They're really good opportunities to talk to one another about how we set expectations about respect. Another thing I know congregations can struggle with is this concept of creating safe space. And partly I think this is a struggle because safety means different things to different people. And so with those different expectations, it's important that we put extra effort into talking as a community about what our understanding of respect means and what are our shared understandings of what kind of behavior is acceptable, what kind of behavior is not ideal, but can be, worked with, and then what behavior is completely unacceptable, like what needs to be addressed in a more holistic way. I hope that as you start these processes for yourself, or as you continue these processes, you'll come up with some of your own personalized reasons for this. But I want to just give one example from that workshop that I spoke about earlier with a group of elders who were starting this process. One of them made the comment that, we're such a tight-knit community in our congregation, and it feels really painful that gender and sexuality are topics that feel untouchable. It feels like a disconnect between how we see ourselves as a tight-knit community that we can't have this conversation. And so thinking about, for them, this sense of, okay, I might be having uncomfortable conversations, but it's important to me and my sense of integrity as a leader here that we break our silence about this and learn to have these conversations in a good way. So that can be an example of how having these deeper foundational understandings of why you're doing the work can benefit you in this process. I've also included here on the screen just a reminder about one definition of inclusion that can be useful, reminding ourselves that inclusion is the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders, especially underserved and marginalized populations, trust to be respectful and accountable. And I use that definition as a reminder that this process can and hopefully will benefit LGBTQ people in the church and their families. And also, I think that it can improve the experience of anyone in the church, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The better we get at having complex conversations in a healthy and respectful way, the better everyone is served by our churches. Okay, as you start getting into your planning of what you want this process to look like for you, this is really focusing on what's a more formalized process. But keep in mind, even outside of a set plan that, okay, we have this issue we want feedback on and we want to do a process. If there's informal conversations, these are tools you can have in your toolbox. So you've got the option of hosting one-on-one conversations, offering one-on-one conversations. This is often where congregations will start. There might be an announcement on Sunday mornings and in the newsletter or any other number of ways to say, we as a session are beginning to talk about, it could be the wedding policy, it could be we've been reviewing the Rainbow Community Report that came out a few years ago, and we are interested in hearing from the congregation. If you would like to speak with one of us, you can set up an appointment with, and then list off whoever is on that listening team. Often this is where people start because most people will feel more comfortable sharing their thoughts when they're on their own with someone rather than in front of a big group. You've got the potential in these conversations to go a little bit deeper and ask more specific questions for people. Another tool that you have in your toolbox is to have kind of small group listening opportunities. So for example, you might say, youth group is gathering on Friday night for an activity. Let's see if we can take some of their time and ask for their thoughts on this. Could be similar that you might say, okay, there's a couple of new families in the congregation. I'm curious about what they think on this. Or it could be asking for a couple of people who maybe used to be on session or other people who've served in leadership in the past or who hold a certain amount of sway and influence and respect within the congregation to say, we're just curious to start having some conversations in a group setting. We want to make sure that we're understanding the needs of different groups and different experiences. Small groups are a good chance to, if you know that there are certain like high trust groups already in the congregation, so groups that are already comfortable talking quite openly with each other about complex things. Perhaps, another example could be if you've got a few people who lead Bible study or who are in a Bible study together that, are talking about all kinds of things all the time. They might feel comfortable having these conversations together in a way that they wouldn't be in front of the congregation as a whole. I think that these can also be a useful opportunity to sort of pilot questions or processes for our next tool, which would be an information session that you would host for the congregation as a whole. People can show up as they want. Usually this will include a short presentation that goes over context, gives people more information about the decisions the church has made, how we arrived at those decisions. In some cases, if it's after a certain amount of discernment time, the session might say, we've been reading books together over the past year, and we want to present a little sampling of theological perspectives on this issue. This is not a debate, but we just want to share what we've been learning and what's been surprising us. And then invite time for people to either in table groups or as a whole, bring up their feedback and questions. Clear guidelines in this case are very, very important. So again, being able to say, this is the purpose of this meeting. This is how we will demonstrate respect to one another. We will respect one another even as we disagree. Having those in place is really key. In part, that's also because I know that for 2S LGBTQI+ people in the church, there is a feeling that if a conversation hasn't been had about these topics and is suddenly being put on the table, that sometimes people will lash out, or there's a concern of, well, this has been comfortable enough so far, but if we talk about it openly, like, how is that going to go? So making sure that people know what is expected of them is really, really key. Another benefit to having these info sessions is that it's a forum for you to make sure people are all hearing accurate information in the same space. And one of my ministry colleagues has also said that she found it useful because it gave people a chance to hear each other's stories. And that might be one of the criteria you set, is that we're not here to debate the Bible. We're not here to pull out a lot of expert reports or anything. We just want to hear from each other about our own personal experiences. And we're not going to judge those experiences. We just want to get to know how we all come at this issue a little bit better. Another part of the planning process is to get together your group of listeners. Often this might be a subset of session. It could be that all elders on the session take up some listening responsibility, perhaps like within their district. It might be that your session says, we're not really comfortable being the ones to have these conversations, or maybe one or two of us are, but we need other people to help with this. Are there other people in the congregation who are good at this pastoral care? It shouldn't fall just on one person. This should be a group endeavor. It's important to share the weight around a little bit and make sure that it's not just one person trying to interpret everything that they're hearing. You'll want to make sure that you agree upon how you want to communicate what you hear back to the rest of the listening team, especially when it comes to things like confidentiality. Are you going to share things without sharing who told you? Are you looking just for themes? Are you looking for excerpts of stories? How do you want to be communicating about that together? How often are you meeting to talk about these things? Are you sharing things over email? Like all of these kind of specific features you want to be talking about. And then as a group and as individuals, I think assessing your readiness and asking yourself, again, how comfortable am I to have these conversations? You maybe don't need to be at the level 5 from our poll earlier, but you probably want to be close to a 4 or a 5. That doesn't mean you have to have all the answers. It just means that you need to be able to be a non-anxious presence in those conversations, and to feel equipped that if a conversation isn't going the way that you expect, that you feel sure that you have the tools you need to de-escalate and end the conversation in a good way. To talk a bit more about understanding what the role of a listener is, there's a few key components that come up, that some of which I've mentioned already, creating a safe container for conversation, being a non-judgmental, compassionate listener, honoring confidentiality, ensuring that the person's perspectives are reported back to the rest of the listening group. And then in group or information session context, listeners may also be some of the people who are giving that upfront presentation, or they'll be the ones setting expectations and facilitating respectful conversations. Okay, so once you've done some of that planning and you've decided what are the modes of listening process we're going to do, who's involved in this listening, who's responsible for what, how are we going to do this, it's time to start communicating with the congregation about the process. So on this slide, I've covered a few things that members of your congregation would probably want to know. So what is it that you are trying to do with these listening conversations, and what are you not trying to do? So again, for example, you might say, we are hoping to hear from you about, and then give them a couple of questions that might guide the conversations. You can say these conversations are so that elders can be available to answer questions. Using this as an opportunity to say, we are not having these conversations to convince anyone of anything. These are not debates. Giving a chance to set those expectations early and often. I've also put here on this slide, make sure that people have many opportunities to hear that this is happening. From a fairness perspective, if people say, oh, well, I didn't know that you were listening to people about that half a year ago, that might tell you that you maybe need to slow down and do a little bit more of this process. Give people lots of options, again, so whether that's, you can talk to us one-on-one, you can talk to us in a small group, maybe your family wants to have a conversation with us, or you want to bring a friend with you. Some people might feel comfortable having that conversation in their own homes, or over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or some other software. Some people might want a phone conversation. In some cases, a person may say, I don't want to have this conversation at church. I'd rather do that away from this building. I want it to feel like a safe, comfortable space. So having lots of flexibility, letting people have these conversations on their own terms can be useful when there are people who've had really negative experiences in church from having conversations about sexuality or gender, whether it's their own, a loved one's, or in general. Make sure that as you're inviting people to be in contact with session or your listening team, that they understand what you mean by confidentiality, that they understand how information will be shared and for what reason it would be shared. And making sure that you give everyone access to the same background information is also a good thing to keep in mind from a fairness perspective. So it doesn't have to be a lot of background information. You might say, here is a short 2-page summary of the decisions the church has made. Here's a quick paragraph about what the session is currently talking about. Might provide links for where people can learn more. If you are hosting a group conversation or information session, giving people a covenant of care ahead of time so that they can think about the expectations being set and whether they can honor those is useful. It gives them a chance to ask questions of, okay, well, you put this on the covenant of care. What do you mean by that? Again, it's just giving people lots of time and opportunities, both to engage in the process and also to ask questions about the process. Okay, so you've communicated about the process, you planned the process, and you start getting people reaching out saying, great, I would love to have a conversation. Can we set up a time and get together next week? Some advice that I have about hosting these conversations and preparing yourself within the context of that conversation is to consider developing a ritual or routine for beginning the conversation. So that can be a personal routine for the 15 minutes beforehand, right? So let's say you are inviting someone to come to your home to have a conversation, or you're doing this over Zoom. Maybe you decide, okay, I'm gonna spend some time making a pot of tea so that I have something comforting to drink and to hold on to help me stay grounded. And I'm going to come up with a prayer that I say every time that I do this for myself, just to make sure that I feel as prepared as possible, that I feel like I'm in a good headspace. Once you are now meeting with that person, I always try to start conversations like this by reiterating expectations and making sure people know that they can ask questions before you get started, particularly about things like confidentiality and note-taking. As you're in the conversation, remember that your role is to provide a non-judgmental space and to listen. Your job is not to convince anyone of anything, and you do not need to have all of the answers in one conversation. In fact, that's probably something I would share as one of your starting expectations, that we can have more than one conversation about this. If you've got questions and I don't have the answers immediately, I am committed to going and finding those answers and returning to this conversation with you. Ideally, these conversations are not ending with someone saying, well, I feel like I now just have to leave because we're having this conversation at all. Hopefully people will say, we're in relationship with each other. We've been part of this congregation for a long time. And we're committed to working out this conversation together over a period of time into the future. Again, as a listener, part of your role is to lean into curiosity. So you may want to have a bank of questions that that are available to you, so that if you feel a pause in conversation and you don't know where to take it from there, you've got an easy list to reference that you might come back to for questions that you want more information about. And sometimes that could be a simple question like, okay, well, you've just shared that you think this. Could you tell me how you came to that opinion? Or can you tell me where you learned that? Can you tell me what experiences have informed that opinion? Some advice from Betty Priest, who's a mediator and is a professor teaching peace and conflict studies. You want to look for yesable statements, especially in these conversations that might feel a bit more uncomfortable, or you might feel a misalignment in perspective. Look for some common ground where you can. And that can be as simple as, yeah, you've talked a lot about how the Bible is very important to you. And I also find the Bible really important to me as a disciple and as a leader within a congregation. I think these are really complex stories, and I think it's important that we put energy into making sure we understand them and allow ourselves to keep asking questions. In some cases, sharing your own story might be helpful. It can be good to reflect ahead of time on how much of your own story you want to share, and what feels comfortable. But again, I would largely, in these kind of conversations, try to focus on encouraging the other person to share and holding back a little bit more as a listener. You want to avoid situations where it feels like you're now placing the responsibility on that other person to tend to your pastoral care needs. But having a story or two that you feel can demonstrate where you're at in your own journey, whether it's on these topics or not, it could be, sharing, this is part of why I really value this congregation, right? This is, again, for a yesable statement, I hear you saying how much you care about our congregation and how much you want the best for all of us. I feel the same way. When I came to this church, XYZ thing happened, and that's how I knew I wanted to be part of this community and how I knew that I was home, and I want that for everyone else. So keep in mind what level of sharing feels appropriate, what level of sharing helps you connect with someone versus making it kind of overtake the conversation. I've said here, you may encounter misconceptions or a lack of knowledge about terminology or how the PCC makes decisions. You almost certainly will. No matter how hard we try as church leaders, there will always be people that we can't reach when we're talking about how we make decisions, or people will have heard something that doesn't line up with reality. So it's always our job to make sure people have access to accurate information. There are ways to share things that are compassionate. It doesn't have to, again, turn into an escalated, heated conversation, but to say, "Oh, I'm not so sure about that." And that might even be something that if you're not sure how to respond to it, you can say, "I'm not sure about that. Let me get back to you." Because that can kind of take the heat off of that moment. And consider as well, what are your options for closing those conversations in a good way? For example, you might want to have a time period in mind. It's often exhausting for people if we have these conversations for more than about 45 minutes to an hour. So keep in mind what feels like a reasonable limit. You might want to communicate that ahead of time. And again, maybe come up with a few phrases for yourself about how you wind down a conversation. As part of that, I would also think about how you incorporate prayer perhaps into these conversations. Some people, especially if they've had negative experiences with the church and have told you about that, may not want to wrap up a meeting like this with prayer or start with prayer. So checking in with people about what feels comfortable is usually a good idea. But one way or another, you want to make sure that you're not just abruptly ending the conversation and saying, "Okay, bye, see you Sunday." You want to make sure that people feel, this maybe isn't the metaphor right now, but like that you've gradually flown into the sky and now you are gradually landing in a good way. You want to make sure that you're landing that plane. Some thoughts about how to take care for yourself after pastoral conversations and what your responsibilities are would be to plan some ways to unwind after challenging conversations. And not every conversation that you have about this will feel challenging, but it does require a certain energy from us to hold space for people and encourage open conversation, particularly about topics that we're not used to talking about. So whether that's going for a walk, spending time with a pet, working on a crossword puzzle, if that helps you unwind, spending some time in prayer or reflection. All of these things are good examples of what you can do to try to, ease yourself back out of that space and back into the more regular flow of your day. You may want to be mindful as well that you're not booking like back-to-back conversations. Giving yourself some transition time is usually helpful. It's a good idea as well to follow up, whether it's a couple days later or about a week later with whoever you spoke with, just to thank them again for the conversation, remind them that you're there for further conversation, follow up with answers to any questions that you couldn't answer in the moment. It's best not to leave people hanging and feeling like they've shared of themselves and then nothing has happened. And then in terms of responsibilities, make sure that you're meeting with your team again to share and reflect on the input you've gathered from these various conversations. What are some of the themes coming up? Based on those themes, what are the next steps? You might learn in these conversations about areas of this topic that people want to learn more about. You might learn about, potential projects that people are interested in, study opportunities people are interested in. If you hear from people in the congregation for the first time about perhaps having an LGBTQ loved one that they've never talked about in church, and maybe you hear that from a couple of different people, you might ask, "Are you comfortable with me sharing this with someone else in the congregation who has a similar experience? Would you want to have a conversation and connect together about that?" Every context is different and so many different things might come up. So take your time reflecting on what you've heard and figuring out what are good ways forward from that. that is the end of our overview presentation.